We were talking about the Health and Human Services and Veterans Affairs. I wanted to bring up the example of amputees. You know, veterans have lots of amputees that they work with, and they work at prosthetics, and they're like some of the best researchers in the whole world working at prosthetics. Health and Human Services would like to take some of that technology and be able to distribute that to the general population. So when we fund research on amputees, do we send money to Health and Human Services? Do we send money to Veterans Affairs? Can we encourage Veterans Affairs to work with Health and Human Services? Well, if we do, then maybe the VA doesn't look like it's doing a great job, and does the VA want to subsidize research that's going to be sent throughout the rest of the world? So, I mean, this is some significant issue about how organizations behave, because they want to have good reputations and they want to serve their purpose, and when their purpose and their clients overlap, there's going to be some conflict. Another example is when we have functional versus aerial-based agencies, like in the State Department. The State Department has functional bureaus that deal with environmental or scientific issues, humanitarian affairs. They also have area-based agencies that deal with regions and countries. And so if we have a part of the State Department that works with Southeast Asia, and we're talking about humanitarian issues, you have these two separate groups of people who have a vested interest in knowing what's going on and how to solve that problem. Well, what if the humanitarian affairs people have a different perception about what the real problem is, and the Southeast Asia people have a real different idea about it, but they're both experts? How do you get them to work together? And that causes some conflict, and you have to coordinate those issues. You don't want to lose their specialized expertise, but you have to force them to work together, and that can be really difficult. Gosh, there's all sorts of new issues that are coming up, and not all issues fit, squarely into environmental problems or international problems. Or, think about terrorism, for example. We're talking about money transfers. We're talking about military work. We're talking about organizations that exist in other countries. So we got the State Department involved. We're talking about violation of laws. So the State Department, Treasury Department, Justice Department, Defense Department, other departments might have big, broad purposes that encompass a lot of issues where terrorism could fit. And so as we try to work on terrorism-related issues, all those agencies have a vested interest in making sure that they're doing the right thing, and they all have different expertise. And how do we bring these different experts together and value their expertise, but be able to come up to a solution that's going to solve that problem? These are really hard things to deal with. So we have conflict, and how do we resolve that conflict as part of that issue? So some of this just relies on coordination. If we can coordinate how these different agencies work together or don't work together, and solve some of those problems, then we can increase the functionality of our agencies. So any kind of conflict is going to undermine coordination. If we have leaders at the tops of agencies who don't get along, they're going to instruct their agencies to not get along with each other. So we've got to figure out how to set up systems and processes where they start talking to each other, start working together, and appreciate the other agency's valid jurisdictional boundaries over that area. So we'll talk about two broad ways: horizontal coordination, where every organization gets to stay where they're at in the same power relationship with each other. We'll talk about strategies that they can use to coordinate that way. And then ultimately, if that doesn't work out, most often what happens is we start reorganizing. We pull agencies from where they're at, we put them under the control of some other person, another organization, and we force them to work together structurally. That's much harder to do, and the president can't do that. Congress has to reorganize. So let's talk about horizontal coordination. There are four broad ways that we do that. We can use interagency agreements, interagency committees. We can do lead agency formula or clearance procedure. So let's talk about these. Interagency agreements are essentially like treaties that are negotiated between the agencies to establish which boundaries they have and clarify which agencies can do what without interference from somebody else. So sometimes this is to say this agency has control over this issue. And sometimes it's to say, well, we're going to give you a little permission to enter into our jurisdiction, and we're going to take a little permission to go into your jurisdiction. So for example, if you live in two separate cities, if you live in a city and you travel through another city, as you're traveling to that other city and you cross into that boundary, under most arrangements, you leave the protection or the control of your police department when you leave your city. The police department, without an interagency agreement, would have to stop patrolling in your area. So if you're speeding and you leave your city, that city police officer no longer has control to ticket you or to pursue you. So what we do is we set up an interagency agreement between those two cities that says, hey, we're going to talk on this specific frequency to coordinate our behavior. If you're in pursuit of somebody and you enter into our jurisdiction, we're going to allow you to pursue them for a certain distance. We're going to ask that you call us on the radio, and then at some point you're going to turn over control of that pursuit to that new jurisdiction. These are essentially, ways that organizations can stake their turf in how they coordinate with each other so that they don't fight. And we have incidents like that between the Navajo Nation and the state of New Mexico, kind of where I used to live, where if you were in the county in New Mexico and you zoomed into the Navajo Nation, the county sheriff had to stop the pursuit because they had no agreement between them and the Navajo Nation about what radio frequencies they were going to call, who was going to take over the pursuit, ultimately who would be, where that person would be prosecuted for the crime or an offense. So now they've worked on some agreements where at least they talk to each other and they can coordinate their behavior. But without that agreement, people were zipping into the Navajo Nation at like blurry speeds, trying to get out of the state of New Mexico. So these interagency agreements are like these treaties. Now, an interagency committee is different. An interagency committee is an agreement by those agencies to sit down and routinely talk with each other where they have common interests or common jurisdictions. Essentially, they set up a place to discuss issues, and maybe those agreements can be hammered out by those committees, but more or less those committees work on solving the problems kind of in real time. So they collaborate with each other. They get to know each other well. They know what their stakes are, who's working with who, and how that works. Let me talk about, for example, an emergency management committee. When you have a natural disaster or a chemical disaster, they have committees in place already that deal with these natural disasters because the fire department, the police department, the public relations office out of a city, maybe there's a hazardous waste cleanup crew, maybe there's a state agency or a county agency. They all have a vested interest to make sure that pollutants don't go into the air, that chemicals aren't spread widely, that doesn't get in the water. In case of an emergency, that committee will get together, like right now, when that happens, and they will work out how they're going to solve that problem. But they've all agreed that they're going to sit down and work together in that committee. Committees can meet routinely, or they can meet just in case of an emergency, but it's essentially a spot where they know it's safe to work together. Okay, a lead agency formula is another horizontal coordination strategy. It essentially is like an interagency agreement. It's kind of like a treaty, but it really is just an agreement about which agency is going to be in control of the situation when they all respond under different circumstances. So imagine, for example, we get a 911 call, and on the 911 call, the caller says, "Oh my gosh, my neighbor's house is on fire. I know they deal drugs, and it looks like someone's shot in the front yard." Well, who's going to show up? It's going to be the police, the fire department, the hazmat crew. Maybe there's a drug enforcement squad. The paramedics are going to show up. Well, who's in charge? Well, we got a house burning. We got a person dying on the ground. Like if we send in the paramedics, they might be at risk from the fire. We know there's hazmat because it's chemical. Because of the drug use, someone might be an active shooter there. So essentially, a lead agency formula says under the conditions that we described, the police probably should take charge at first because we want to make sure that there's no danger. So the police come and they check the area. All the fire departments waiting there. They're taking the lead from the police. As soon as the police clear the space, and now that condition has changed, it's not dangerous that someone's going to shoot you, then the fire department might step in. And the fire department is going to coordinate all of those other resources. So the fire department might tell the police, hey, go cordon off this area. The fire department might say to the hazmat team, go do this. The fire department might say, to the paramedics, go pick up that person. So it did, under different conditions, different agencies are going to take the lead in coordinating the behavior of the other agencies. Let's say, before the police have cordoned all off, the police are still in charge. The police can say to the fire department, you can work on this side of the building. You can work on that side of the building. But until we get everything safe, we're in charge. So it describes the conditions under which each agency is in charge. When I worked with the Office of Surface Mining as a consultant, Office of Surface Mining was the lead agency on environmental reviews on the mines. That means they coordinated the behavior of the EPA, the Navajo Nation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, all the regulatory agencies. They were in charge because it was on a mine. If it were off a mine, Office of Surface Mining might be interested, but they're not the lead. So a lead agency formula is like a treaty that determines which agency is in charge of coordinating the other agency's behaviors under different circumstances. The last is clearance procedure. It's a little bit hard to wrap your brain around, but clearance procedure is essentially saying, well, all these different agencies, all these different organizations who have an interest in this issue can all come together and work together. But some agencies might not really care about working on all the details. Maybe all they want is to be able to review the plan and make sure it's okay with them. That's when clearance procedure comes in. The agency doesn't give up the right to be involved in the process, but they just don't want to be into the details. So they get to review the plan and approve the plan or not, or veto the plan. In California, we have an environmental review process for new developments. Most of the time, the California Fish and Wildlife agencies, they don't really want to be involved in all the new development plans. But they want to make sure that Fish and Wildlife's interests are protected. And so what they do is they have a clearance procedure. So the city or the county work with the developer to work on the development plans. They work with water agencies, they work with waste agencies, they work with school districts, they work with all those different districts at that lower level. And once they get that plan to a spot where they all sort of agree, then they send it off to the California Fish and Wildlife agencies for their review. And the Fish and Wildlife agencies can say, yep, that's a great plan, it's not going to be a problem. Or they could say, well, you've got to address this issue, and they'll send it back. Or they can simply veto it and say, no, we're not going to approve that. So this is like clearance procedure. We have to get clearance from the Fish and Wildlife agencies so that they can be okay with the development, but they don't want to be in the details because 99% of the stuff doesn't matter to them, but the 1% that does, they want to make sure that they don't lose their interest. So clearance procedure is this other way that we can get organizations to coordinate where they all have the same power, even under interagency agreements, interagency committees, lead agency formula, clearance procedure. All those agencies stay in their same organizational structure. They don't lose any power. They all get to, work with their same system, but they're forced to work together, sort of in different ways. Now, if we can't get agencies or organizations to work together, what do we do? Well, ultimately what happens is, if it's important enough, we will reorganize. And reorganization is vertical integration or interagency coordination through vertical means. Like, essentially, when you have two agencies that aren't working together, the legislature or Congress or the city council can force these two agencies together and make them work together. How will they do that? Well, they could demote both of them and put them in charge of put somebody else in charge of both of them. Or they can force them together and create a new coordinating type position. Office of Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, it was essentially that second one, where we took a bunch of agencies that should be working together, but they weren't sharing information very well, and they smashed them into a brand new department and put a new head over all those agencies. That forces them to work together because the head can, the head of the agency can force each of these agencies to talk to each other. They have legal authority to make them work together. Director of National Intelligence is similar. People have to report back to the Director of National Intelligence. What happens is, in this reorganization, when they restructure, people in those organizations lose power because now they have somebody else that they have to go through in order to get to higher levels of the organization. And now we have new political problems because those organizations have to fight with each other for resources, and they might not like each other. So most agencies really do fight vertical reintegration or vertical coordination. And even Congress and the legislature don't really like to do this. They like, and we'll talk about that at the end, but ultimately, if they can get agencies to work horizontally, they're going to be way better off. We'll talk about staff in just a second.